Well, it's at the half hour now, so welcome to the second week of the book club covering high output management. I've hit record to start recording the session, and just a reminder that we'll have an off camera session, or sorry, a non-recorded session towards the end if people feel that there's anything that they want to discuss further, but not be recorded. So welcome back to those who've decided to join in for the second round. I hope that we found the last week interesting. I know I quite enjoyed the discussion. And just a reminder that while it's very interesting to hear all of the different details about certain parts of the company, just a reminder that we've got people from all over the company joining, so to try keep the discussion at a higher level than going down into too many of the details. But with that in mind, shall we begin? Great. So the second part was called Management is a Team Game, and I found it significantly longer than the first part, that's for sure. Yeah, Sean, did you also find the same thing?
Yeah, not only longer, but it really it set up the breakfast factory metaphor at the start, and then it sort of went quite deep into the details of how things work at Intel, which I thought was really interesting. To be clear, I just it was noticeable that it sort of dropped that metaphor for the time being, or put it to one side before moving on. But yeah, it was. It seems like parts 2 and 4 are a lot longer, as Thomas called out in the first place. But it was definitely interesting.
No, for sure. I also found that it was part 2 then had 4 chapters. There was leverage. There was one about meetings, one about decisions, and another one about planning. As we've said in the notes there, we found the planning section. Well, I found that I didn't find as much value in it as the first 3 sections. But as we get started on the discussion today, we can see if other people felt the same way. But the thing that I found really interesting in the chapter about leverage was about how formal authorization is useful because it enforces the discipline of the process. And I've been part of processes before where you have to provide lots of motivation for why you want to do something, and asking for approval for sometimes small things and sometimes quite expensive things. And I hadn't seen it before as about the process of asking for it more than just the accomplishment of the process. I was interested if anyone else had similar thoughts there.
I'll jump in while we see if anybody else wants to. Yeah, I think that was really interesting. It's it's a thing I think about with things like promotions and also expenses for trips or events or whatever. A lot of the time, the process of doing the justification is the step that the person is authorizing. It would be pretty unusual for a lot of these cases for someone to reject that, assuming that the person who's requesting it has followed the right process and has done their due diligence there and created the correct justifications. So that step is really about having that discipline rather than about litigating all of the justifications that they have there. Is that the same as what you took from it, Rachel?
No, absolutely. And what you also said there about making sure that people have followed the process. I think he even referenced in the book that sometimes he was having to approve things where he didn't understand everything about what he was approving, but he was verifying that the thought process had been correct. And if the thought process is correct, there's no reason to deny the request. But he's just encouraging people to follow a particular thought process while requesting whatever it is that needed to be requested.
Yeah, I think at some level it's about we talk in the handbook about people being managers of one, and also about the directly responsible individual often being someone very close to the work. So we're not interested in micromanaging necessarily so much as being able to be confident that we can trust that someone's taking the right steps to make their decisions, so that they can make those decisions and we can trust those decisions.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing that I found really interesting in the leverage section was about, the quote there was, how you handle your own time is the single most aspect of being a role model and a leader. And it was just nice to see it so concisely put in one sentence how important that is.
Yeah, I think, and again, like, people feel free to jump in. This is not just a conversation between me and Rachel. It's just Rachel and I are happy to run the conversation if no one else wants to jump in, because we're also running the book club. So we've got more invested. I think the main way I've learned this is actually from the less good managers I've had in the past than from the better managers. Because when a good manager's doing this, I don't think you notice it so much, or at least I haven't in the past. I've been quite oblivious to this, that they've been managing their time well. When I've had a manager who hasn't been managing their time so well, it's become more obvious, because it seemed like they're doing things that they're spending their time on things that aren't directly related to what their team is responsible for, or they don't have time for the things that their team is responsible for. And so it becomes more obvious when it's not happening than when it is happening. But I think sort of modeling what you want from people is sort of a good approach in general. Do as I say, not as I do is what's the word I'm looking for? Is a thing that, like, is said as sort of a joke for a reason, right? Like, it's much more impactful if you're asking someone to do what you can be seen doing as well.
But I think another one of the most obvious ways that you see if a manager is not doing the right thing, and he calls it in the book as well, is through meddling. And
yes.
That's been the most clear thing that I've seen in the past from managers that have been less good, is that they just want to get involved in everything, and they don't, and as a result, it actually makes the problem worse. So Craig, I think you're unmuting there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm still catching up. I'm Craig, new to the book club, and I haven't read it all yet. What's the definition of middling in the book?
I guess it's I guess micromanaging, like when you're getting way too involved in the details of something that someone's doing. I suppose in engineering management, it would be asking about every single specific line of code, and then trying to second guess everything that your team member is doing, when in actual fact most of the time you need to trust that they're going to do the right thing and get on with it, and only get involved when there's an absolute and when there's a very specific need to do so, not just because you're bored and it's a Thursday or something.
I'm trying to look up the definition in the book, but one thing I think of it in context of is a bit later in those notes, where it talks about there are ways you can increase your leverage as a manager, and this could be a know-how manager or a people manager, but you can also create negative leverage. And I think meddling is a great example of that. Like, it's making you slower, and it's making the person you're meddling with slower. It's possibly also making other people on the team slower if they're worried that you're going to meddle with what they're doing. Like, it's got big impact, but in the wrong direction. So I'll try and find the exact reference in the book, but that's how I see it.
Okay. Yeah, I'll look it up too. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I really like the kind of counterexample of like a high leverage thing being, instead of getting down in the weeds and helping your report to execute on something that, like, if they're struggling, if you see them struggling, instead of just doing it for them, thinking about how you can enable them to figure things out for themselves, and then that might help other team members as well, and it becomes like an organizational thing rather than you just like swooping in to rescue them. It's like, well, what do they need? What resources can I point them towards or create so that they can just take this over themselves?
Yeah, I've got a quote here. So it's talking about meddling. It says, the negative leverage produced comes from the fact that after being exposed to many such instances, the subordinate will begin to take a much more restricted view of what is expected of him, showing less initiative in solving his own problems and referring them instead to his supervisor. Because the outcome of the organization will consequently be reduced in the long run, meddling is clearly an activity having negative managerial leverage. So it's also about what that says about what responsibility you expect your team to have. Like, I guess another way of putting it would be like, if you're meddling in someone's work, that indicates you think they are more junior than perhaps their position in the organization indicates.
It's probably too much of a sidetrack, but I'll link to a video in the manager channel related to sort of empowering employees and how that has huge positive impacts on the output of everyone. So it's the inverse example of this, I think.
Would you mind putting that in the doc as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
Yeah, just so anybody catching up with the notes can see that as well. How did people feel about the uncontrolled interruptions part? Because I know, I think basically every manager in this call manages a lot of people who have to potentially deal with interruptions quite often. I mean, Rebecca, maybe from the content team perspective, I know you're a sort of manager there, but you've been interrupted a lot. Like, how does that feel from that perspective as well?
Do you mean like as a manager or as a person who is managed?
Well, as both, because you have both. Well, you certainly have the latter perspective right now, pretty fresh, I guess.
Yeah, I think I wasn't sure what to make of the kind of office hours suggestion, because like I just can't imagine asking people to delay their Slack message to me until a certain time. Like if it's something that's not time sensitive, I try and reinforce, like, ask on the issue or the merge request if there is one. And like, if it is urgent, ping me with a link to the issue or the merge request and we'll go there. But certainly as someone on the, outside of engineering, I think our days and weeks and months are a lot less structured in terms of like, there's no code freeze for publishing to the blog. So there's a lot of kind of adaptation required when stuff comes in hot, whether or not that could have been avoided. And I've been trying to reinforce kind of the idea that, like, just like anything else at GitLab, you start with an issue and you communicate early what your need is. But I would love to know if someone feels like they have got this licked, because I still don't think we figured it out entirely.
Well, that was also something that was so interesting, is that it actually came up in the book, and this book is not a new book by any means. So it was nice to know that this isn't a new problem that has suddenly just arrived with the invention of email and more direct communication methods. Like, this was a problem all the way back then. Yeah. And they do offer to impose a way, like to impose a pattern on the way that the manager copes with certain problems, but also through all of the patterns that I could think of, aside from portioning out certain areas of your day to deal with certain things, I couldn't really come up with different ways to avoid people bringing the interruptions to you in the first place.
Yeah, I think the way I think of that is, sorry, Darby, did you unmute there? I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, go ahead, though. I'll jump in after you.
No, you go. I've talked enough.
So I guess, like, as I was looking at this, the one thing that came to mind is how, like, the async culture here and sort of the expectations for communication actually make this a lot better than in other companies I've been at. You have, at a normal office job, you've got this like 8 or whatever hour block of time that you're available, and you're expected to be on responding to people immediately in Slack and things like that. And here we have a much more, obviously the distributed nature and the expectations, I think, that come along with things mean that, I can batch up work and get back to people, and things aren't an immediate fire. Even when someone pings me in Slack, I don't feel that like sense of panic that I normally would, that like, oh, I've got 10 things in Slack that I gotta do right away. I can kind of batch that up. I don't know if that's the same for everybody else. Maybe I'm still a little new and it's a little bit easier for me, but I think that's been like a pretty unique thing. So
something that like I struggle with, though, because like I do think it is up to us to manage our time and go, like, if you're just not going to check Slack for 3 hours while you focus on something, then we should be empowered to do that. But as a manager, one of the main things that you should be doing is unblocking people who report to you. And if they are stuck on something because they need an answer, like, does me just going AWOL for 3 hours while I protect because that reminded me in the book when he brought up someone's strategy was to just like hide to get work done, which I've thought about doing. I've thought about taking a day off and then being like, surprise, I was working the whole time. I just wasn't responding to anything. But now other people are relying on me to be able to move forward. And that feels like kind of neglect as a manager. So I'm not totally sure how to square with that.
Well, I suppose one way to think about it is if you did block out a certain amount of time, I don't know how long it is, be it an hour or 2 hours, or maybe even a push 3 hours. Sometimes you're blocking time out in your calendar to get things done, but you may also have been in a meeting for that length of time. And if you're in a meeting for that length of time, you wouldn't really be able to step in and offer ways to unblock people in your team, because you would be focusing on the people in the meeting and getting through whatever it is that those people needed from you. I'm not exactly sure how that translates to, an async culture here, but I would say that blocking out certain periods of time, it's necessary for you to get through what you need. But as long as the period of time is not so great that now you're starting to become a bottleneck for others on the team, I guess.
So what's interesting to me is the technology has changed so much since you wrote the book, that obviously there's different things that are going on here, right? So I don't know if I would necessarily say it's because we all work remotely, but I do say it is how we are expecting to communicate with each other in those aspects. The one thing I don't like about Slack and the current belief that it's async is just exactly that, which is if somebody is truly blocked or there's some critical business need and I'm not checking in on it, then that's a concern I have. Though, to be honest, like, I'm not looking at the granularity of days. I'm looking at the granularity of an hour, let's say. And the Pomodoro technique kind of pushes that from the perspective of focus on one specific thing. Don't look at other things, and just make sure that for 25 minutes you're solely focused on that activity. Give yourself a break for 5 minutes, and then kind of come back to it from that perspective. So when I look at this, I think us pushing for using Slack async is great. The one thing I would love is to be able to give people who think it's important, like I need you right now, right here, because of operational issue or something like that. Some type of indicator beyond that. But I don't know how to do that yet in Slack or otherwise. But that's just that need for helping people.
It's also difficult as well when you push that onto the person causing the interruption, because you're relying on their judgment about what's urgent, which might not match your judgment about what's urgent all the time.
But that's where the conversation has to start, right?
Yeah.
Because like as an example, I constantly have to evaluate whether I'm going to, push an issue to Eric immediately, or put it in our one-on-one document, or put it in an email. And all three of those have different turnaround times associated with them, based on, whatever I think is the criticality of the discussion from that perspective. Or my needs.
I think a conversation about real-time async is pretty interesting, because at some level you're sort of managing expectations as well, right? Like if you are always responsive instantly to someone, I feel like at some level that becomes kind of meddling. So being able to make some determination about the importance or urgency of some request, you definitely want the person to have thought about it for a minute, like time box whatever they're working on, make sure they've actually tried to work through it. I mean, obviously they're going to realize if something's totally broken, it's totally broken. But I do like the element of sort of saying, well, I will get back to you in a reasonable amount of time, but we're intending to build this organization to work asynchronously, so therefore they should have something to be able to move on to that doesn't block them in another direction. So I think at some level it does have to do with managing expectations as well. I'll leave it.
Yeah, and if that actually does decrease the amount of interruptions you have, it'll create the perception of responsiveness, which is counterintuitive, but you're more likely to respond to somebody if you don't have 5 of these interruptions going on at the same time, right? So by definition, setting those expectations is not a bad way of, hey, here's how I like to receive, information, criticality of, when to interrupt me versus not.
going back to Rebecca's point as well, one thing that's, I think I thought I was pretty good at working async anyway, but lately I've had some days or half days where I'm looking after our baby. So I can't really schedule a meeting during that time. I can work, I just can't schedule a meeting. I have to work asynchronously. And that sort of forced me to realize that actually, like, I wasn't working as asynchronously as I thought, but also it's most of the like interruptions in terms of Slack messages probably could be dealt with in another way, and I can nudge back on those and say like, hey, it'll be more efficient for me to deal with it in this way or whatever. And to your point, Rebecca, about like, taking some time out to focus, I guess the way I would think about that is if you need to take some time out for a personal errand, like a medical appointment or whatever, you wouldn't be on call during that time anyway necessarily. So like, from the perspective of someone trying to get in touch with you, it doesn't really matter why you're not available, like to interrupt during that time, you're just not available. So it matters when you think about it, but it doesn't matter from their perspective. The end result is the same, right?
So sorry, I'm going to ask a clarifying question since I haven't read yet. And also, Darby, this is week 3 for me, so I'm the new person. You're not. You've been here months, so you're a tenured veteran here. So when they were talking about uncontrolled interruptions, are they talking about everyone in the organization, or are they focused entirely on managers? Because I have opinions on both stances, I guess.
So they're talking specifically about people managers and what they call know-how managers at the start of the book, which you could consider like, in an engineering context, a technical leader, someone who's like going to be asked for their opinions, even if they don't have responsibility for a particular team. But I'd be interested to hear what you think about both.
Yeah, I think for both, and in my opinion, the responsibility is similar to both, right? The know-how managers and the people managers are the ones who should be fielding more of those uncontrolled interruptions and then guiding their team to a predictable path as much as they can, right? I think managers especially are the ones that should be kind of the funnel to where those uncontrolled interruptions should be, and especially with the newer folks, like, hey, if something comes up, just send them to me. Just focus on what we've committed to for this week, this sprint, this month, whatever the iteration is, unless everything's on fire, send it to me so I can help set expectations outside the org. Because once they start answering those questions and become that vehicle for uncontrolled interruptions, it's hard to close that floodgate again. So I think in my experience as a manager, usually uncontrolled interruptions are especially, there's a high volume for managers because we have to protect our team to make sure that they have that dedicated time and that they can focus on what they're working on. So we should almost be the ones interrupting those uncontrolled interruptions so that then we can put some controls and some metrics around them.
I find, to further that, I find one thing that interesting about working in this sort of open source structure is that because everything is transparent, people have the ability to get involved where they would like to across the organization. And I really like operating as that sort of funnel and that almost barrier to the team, so that I'm helping only let the most important things get through that I can't help. But sometimes I find that the team is really interested in being involved in all of these different things, and I can't help them not be interrupted by the other things that they might be doing, because I just don't know that they're, either I don't know or I can't control all of the other projects that they feel that they need to get interested in. And that's a variety of things, from other engineering projects to getting involved with certain people ops discussions or security discussions or blog discussions, or there's just such a variety of things.
Yeah, and I feel pretty strongly that as a short term, I definitely take that approach that you've sort of outlined there, Craig. But longer term, I definitely am trying to train my team to handle those interruptions appropriately and redirect the person that interrupts them and take ownership of it. And if someone's always interrupting them, things where they say, hey, I'm not going to respond to these, and actually come up with their own strategies. If there's a pattern of interruptions and a pattern of lack of, for want of a better word, respect of someone else's time, then that's where I feel like I ought to get involved, maybe, if that person can't handle it themselves. But ultimately, I want to make sure, and I have been through this with another team that I've worked with, building a team so that they feel totally comfortable saying to someone, hey, this is not appropriate. I have these hours in the day, contact me then, and then managing that themselves. And that to me feels like a better endpoint for that type of situation.
For sure, right. In both cases kind of come down to commitment, right? In Rachel's case, I've had engineers that are always chasing the squirrel too, right? Like, oh, that's cool. And they want to get involved in everything. And the coaching tip I usually give them is, well, you committed to, these things, these 5 things, you got your toes into 30 things and you failed on all of them for the sprint, this iteration. Sometimes it takes a hard failure for them to realize that, they need to rein it in, or they need to scope back on what, if they're going to touch on 30 things instead of 5, then they're going to have much smaller deliverables. And the same thing with coaching individuals to deal with uncontrolled interruptions. Like, hey, I've committed to these things. If what you're saying is much more important than what I've committed to this month, then we can talk about it. But otherwise, it's in the queue behind these things I've committed to.
Well, that seems to have been a great discussion about uncontrolled interruptions, and I'm noticing that the time is ticking on. So I'm suggesting that we jump on to the next chapter, which was talking about meetings. So one of the biggest things that jumped out for me is about declining meetings if you think that it's not actually going to be useful for you. And I think that that's something that takes a lot of courage to do, because you feel, I know in certain cultures you might feel rude declining that invitation, but actually being more precious with your time can sometimes lead to a better outcome for the team, and actually a better outcome for whatever the situation is, rather if you don't step in and get involved where you're not needed. I was wondering if other people had similar opinions, or or how they view meetings where their attendance is somewhat of a question.
So, new person opinion here. I feel better about not attending meetings here than I did at my last job, last couple jobs actually, because I know that there will be an agenda and there'll be a recording that I can follow up on and see what I missed. So I love it. I think it's great.
Yeah, I watched last week's book club, not last week, the week before, the first one on 1.5 times speed for the first time. And I was like, this is life-changing. I think we're better about this at GitLab than most companies, because also we can't assume, like I often get invited to meetings that are really late at night for me because most of my team is in the US. And I think we do a pretty good job of setting the expectation that if you can't attend a meeting for whatever reason, whether it's because it's not useful to you or it's inconvenient, it's absolutely fine. That's been my experience.
Yeah, as a less new person here, I find that meetings generally fall into one of 2 buckets for me, which is like, I am responsible for like actually running part of this meeting, in which case I probably need to be there most of the time. I have a great example as a one-on-one. Like if I or the other person in the one-on-one aren't there, we're not going to have that meeting. But also like, plan stage group meetings, like I have to take a fairly active role in. And then other meetings like group conversations where I'm, exactly as Rebecca said, I can just watch the recording. Like, and as Craig said, like it's probably all written down in the agenda anyway. So for most group conversations, I don't attend. I just read.
Or apparently
what happened afterwards.
To the podcast.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think this is a great example of a skippable meeting as well. Like if you didn't read up with the book, or you didn't feel like you had anything you wanted to say, but you still wanted to hear what other people thought about it, like don't join. Just watch the recording.
One of the types of meetings that you listed there was another one I picked up in the book, was about one-on-ones. And they talked about having one-on-ones for no less than an hour, which I thought was a very long time for a one-on-one. But then I realized that, he also said in the book that at the time, Intel was one of the very, very few companies that was actually doing one-on-ones. And it makes me wonder if something in the landscape has changed over the last series of years around how one-on-ones are done. and maybe the types of questions that are asked. But I was wondering if other people also thought that an hour was quite long, or just how other people's approach to one-on-ones might be.
I know for me, there were a couple things that kind of stood out. One was there's the tech stack aspect, which was they were using paper to push things back and forth as opposed to have a working document associated with it. So I think there's some efficiencies you get by that. At one point, I do remember him talking about middle managers specifically. I think as you get to more senior positions, I hate to say it, but an hour is actually necessary. And this is probably counter to, I'm probably speaking heresy here and counter to GitLab culture, but the reality of the matter is that as the organization grows and you get to a certain size, there are going to be a variety of topics that you need to cover. And based on that's just that additional time is needed from that perspective. The other aspect that I think he kind of talked about was push as much out of the meeting as possible, meaning, if there's things that you can do async, deal with those out of band, so then you're not really covering those in the meeting. It's almost like, like if you get an issue resolved, remove it from the meeting agenda and just focus on the things that kind of worked from that perspective. So that may be able to way again to tighten it back up, but it still feels like I just know, like in my case, there's just a number of things that need to be discussed for a given topic. So because of that, it takes a little longer.
But that is actually interesting that perhaps at different levels the style of the one-on-one does change. So that's really interesting perspective.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I noticed was the timescale obviously was significantly longer for the examples he gave. So it's really hard for me to kind of get my head wrapped around certain aspects of the book or his philosophy, because just, yes, if I'm making a $10 billion decision on where to build a factory, then absolutely there's going to be a lot of planning and process around that. But that's different than the decisions we often make, right? We oftentimes will back up on a decision a month later just based on that. That's not to say that our decisions are less costly, but just go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say we have that in our values that we prefer two-way door decisions for that reason, like decisions where you can roll back on it a month later if you realize, oh, hey, actually we don't want to do this, rather than we're committing X billion dollars to building a factory somewhere, which is less easy to do, obviously. So yeah, I think we aspire to that, but even then we don't have decisions that we can roll back. To take an extreme example, if we were going to lay some people off, you can't really roll that back afterwards. You can rehire, but that's not the same as rolling back the layoffs in the first place, right?
Yeah. Thomas, I saw that you were unmuted there for a moment.
Yeah, and then remuted because the children are running amok outside my door. Speaking from my level, from a one-on-ones, an hour is too long. But I do need I need to figure out a way for ICs to signal that they need more time on a one-off basis prior to a one-on-one occurring, because sometimes there's a lot to discuss and most times there's not. Too frequently from my I'm having one-on-ones devolve into status reports. And that's something I should be able to get asynchronously and be able to ask as a part of an agenda item in advance. But it's too frequently resulting, it's degrading to just, here's my status. And that's all that they are bringing to the conversation is status, where I'm wanting to learn something more deep than just a tactical issue discussion and where they happen to be. But that's just my perspective. Back to the one-on-one conversation.
Do you use the so actually someone I interviewed who was a manager candidate mentioned this. They didn't mention it by having read it in this book, but they also mentioned just always asking one more question at the end, which is also mentioned in this book as a way of trying to break that one-to-one stasis that you can get into.
Yeah, I have a go-to question, and the go-to question is, what do you want to learn next? And it can be a topic, it can be a skill, or it can be, I want to learn a new role, but I want to know what they need to learn next so that I can help direct the conversations towards what they want to engage on from a career development standpoint or a knowledge development standpoint. Because not everything has to do with career, but that's my go-to question, and everybody knows it's my go-to question.
So I'll jump in. At my last company, we had 30-minute one-on-ones, and noticed that a lot of times, not a lot, but sometimes we'd just run out of time. And it was a culture where meetings were back to back constantly. So we'd have to cut it short, and then we'd never finish the conversation. So I bumped it to an hour to create space. And that actually helped a lot. And there was like two side effects from it. Like one, we wouldn't get cut off in the middle of the conversation. But then there was like kind of this extra time to just kind of chat, which kind of helped to build trust and get to know people, like have just not, just what are you doing this weekend? Like those kind of conversations that actually were like pretty beneficial to have. So having just like a little bit of space there, I don't feel like it's as big of a deal here, at least for me, because I don't have, back-to-back meetings all day. But like thinking of it from that perspective, like we don't have to fill all this time, but if we had space for it, we could use it, is another way to think about it. I don't do that here, but I might if we start to go a little long on stuff. So.
I think for me with one-on-ones is the whole point of the one-on-one is that having the person be able to talk with you about whatever it is they feel like they need to address that isn't necessarily bullet pointable, or I can put it in some sort of list. And so for me, it's always been a priority of sort of building a trust with that person so that they can feel comfortable talking with you about issues that they feel upset about, or they feel are a concern, or whatever you want to characterize it as. So I'm generally front loading the chat in my one-on-ones. What have you been up to? How are you doing? I saw you mention this in your stand-up the other day. Did you end up doing this? Like just sort of creating that sort of freedom to just talk about something that they feel interested in, so that you can build that relationship. And then at least in my experience, most of the time that leads to, it doesn't work with everyone, obviously, but most of the time that leads to an environment where people feel comfortable saying, hey, can we skip this one? Or I actually want to talk with you about this thing that's really upsetting, or whatever it is. So I don't know if that's what you meant, Darby, but that's kind of how I've always worked with one-on-ones myself.
So moving forward from the one-on-ones, the other type of meeting that they were talking about is also staff meetings, which is anything that affects more than two of the people present. And I must admit that one of the things I found quite challenging at GitLab is having effective team meetings, because it feels like a lot of things where we need everyone's input can be done asynchronously, and as a result we do that asynchronously. In the Geo team specifically, we have challenges with the time zone, and I mean I hear from Rebecca as well with her team being mostly in the US. But sometimes when we do have the opportunity to schedule these meetings, I feel like I'm not actually sure what to put on the agenda, because almost everything can be done async. And I know that the team meetings are great for the team building aspect and just for getting everyone together and have a chat, but sometimes I'm just cautious of using people's time for just having a chat when perhaps we should be doing something different with that time.
Yeah, we went from having an hour-long weekly content team meeting to now I think it's half an hour every second week. And even that, like, nobody is missing that time, because I think we're just, as the organization matures and like we move into our, we've got more kind of specialized roles, there's less need to collaborate in real time. And so I'm in favor of, we actually have a content happy hour once a month that's like a recurring meeting where there is no agenda. We're totally there just to shoot the breeze. And that's been great for actually doing some dedicated bonding.
So my team is entirely new. We have two folks from other teams that have been here before. We have two people that just were hired within the last 2 weeks, and then there's myself, end of week 3, and Chun, who I think he's been here for 2 months. So we have an entirely new team that sometimes we don't even know what questions to ask, and you can't always get the context from the issue or from the doc or from the Slack or whatever. So right now we have weekly half-hour meetings, and typically we don't cover all the topics. So I would imagine that'll change as we get into a rhythm and figure out how to function as a team. But right now, I think they're super vital for our team.
Yeah, on release we do weekly meetings. We usually don't use all the time, but it's again good to have a space to do that. But I think, Craig, kind of like what you're touching on is something that I think I've been talking to people about recently. It's just like how very different all of our teams are. depending on like how many like brand new people you have or like what time zones you're in. Just like there is not one template for a team at GitLab in any department. Like everything is a unique snowflake. So we got to kind of like be able to adjust to whatever the circumstances are, I think. So it's interesting.
I think at some level, I really like that we can be that adaptive to whatever scenario we have. But at another level, that leads to a lot of uncertainty around how I ought to be doing things. And I don't think that there's necessarily an ought or necessarily a this is the perfect way. And I'm not necessarily looking for the perfect way, but having some sort of boundaries is really helpful. As we know, blue sky is often, look at the blue sky. Blue sky is often a lot harder than saying, hey, here's the little box, but finding a midway between those points is difficult when we're growing and changing so quickly. So, that's my sense of some of those boundaries and guidelines can be really helpful.
Yeah, we've had a few discussions about this between engineering and product. I know we're short on time, so I'll try and keep this quick. And I think it is definitely good to have different ways of doing things, but it's also good for us to be very explicit about like what the shared deadlines are for each team, what the shared expectations are for each team, and also for each team to, and I've not been doing a great job of this, I've been trying to improve on it lately based on some feedback in the plan retros, for each team to say what it is they do, like in their own handbook page, so that like, okay, it might not be easy to get those all in one place, but you can say like, okay, well, how does package do things? How does release do things? How does memory do things? I can go find that out. Like, if we at least have that documented, then it gives someone the opportunity to go through and say, well, hey, I see these commonalities between how different teams do things. Like maybe we should consider like codifying that somewhere, or like, hey, every team is doing this differently. If we're okay with that, we should make it clear that we don't care what a team does in this area. So yeah, I think that documentation is useful, and it's easy to miss because it's often in flux. Like it's like, well, we kind of do it this way, but then we change to doing it this way. So I think that's almost why it's more important to document it.
I was going to call out that I remember a little while back looking at the team page for Secure and thinking like they had a lot of good stuff on there. They talked about like I was just looking at it right now, like their process, their recorded meetings, like their stand-ups and stuff like that. Like it's kind of like what you're talking about, Sean, is like, here's how we do things on Secure. And I remember thinking, yeah, we should do this for release, and then did not do it.
That's something I'm working with the every team since we are just now forming. We're codifying it all on our homepage. So.
And I think that goes further than engineering as well. I mean, something that Rebecca has just said about how they don't necessarily have code freeze deadlines the same that we do, but perhaps now that we're moving more towards auto-deploy, we can actually learn something from the teams that have never worked in that fashion themselves. Perhaps there's certain tips and tricks that they've picked up on how to deal with not having such a firm deadline like that. So I think it would also be interesting to hear how other teams outside of engineering structure their days, weeks, events, and perhaps there's things that we could bring in from that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see on that specific one. I always think of the cadence of software being released as the cadence of putting new code in is continuous, but actually the planning around it is still somewhat synchronous in regards to our product teams and kind of their monthly announcements. So even though we're going to a more continuous delivery model, or at least closer to a continuous delivery model, I don't know if we're going to quite get out of the boat of that just because of the way we currently do product planning. But that indicates what the driver of that is versus, the actual release itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think on that note, I'd like to wrap up the discussion for today, which I think has been really interesting and really useful. And thank you very much all for your time. I just would like to wrap the meeting up with keep to the correct end time. The right way to say it. Thank you all so much. I hope that you enjoy part 3 of the book and looking forward to seeing you all in 2 weeks.
Thanks.